1948, a year that changed South Africa forever. On the surface, it was just another election, but in reality, it marked the beginning of one of the darkest social engineering experiments in modern history. A system that legally divided people by race, dictated where they could live, who they could marry, and even which jobs they could hold. A system the world would later come to know as apartheid. But here is the thing most people don't realize. Apartheid didn't just appear out of nowhere in 1948. It was the product of centuries of conquest, colonization, and racial hierarchy, carefully built brick by brick until it was cemented into law. In today's documentary, we'll trace the dark origins of apartheid from the first Dutch settlers who arrived in 1652 to the British who expanded the empire, to the rise of Afrikaners nationalism and the National Party victory that made apartheid official. By the end of this video, you understand not just how apartheid began, but why it was able to survive for nearly half a century. So stick with me, because this story reveals how history, power, and prejudice collided to create one of Africa's darkest chapters. The story of apartheid begins long before the word itself was ever coined. In 1652, Dutch settlers under the Dutch East India Company landed at the Cape of Good Hope, establishing a supply station for ships traveling to Asia. These settlers, later known as the Boers of Afrikaners, gradually expanded inland, taking land from the indigenous Khoisan and San peoples. By the late 1600s, slavery was introduced and racial hierarchies began to harden. When the British took control of the Cape in 1806, they abolished slavery by 1834. But rather than creating equality, this fueled resentment among Afrikaners who still clung to the idea of white superiority. The Great Trek of the 1830s and 1840s, where Boers moved north to form their own republics, laid the groundwork for future racial segregation. Fast forward to the late 19th century, when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand in 1886. Suddenly, South Africa became an economic powerhouse. But this wealth relied on the cheap labor of black South Africans who were systematically pushed into inferior positions. The Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, between the British and the Boers further complicated matters. When the British won, they established the Union of South Africa in 1910, uniting 4 provinces under white rule. This new union made one thing clear: power would remain in the hands of whites, while black South Africans were denied the vote, denied land, and denied opportunity. Even before apartheid was official, segregation was already entrenched in law. In 1913, the South African government passed the Native Land Act, which reserved about 87% of the land for white ownership, leaving black South Africans with just a fraction of the land, often barren and overcrowded. Families were uprooted, and generations were condemned to poverty. The 1927 Native Administration Act gave the government sweeping power to control African communities. Meanwhile, laws restricted interracial marriage, political participation, and even movements between provinces. By the 1930s and 1940s, South Africa was a country already divided along racial lines. But it was the rise of Afrikaner nationalism that would take these divisions to a whole new level. By the 1940s, South Africa was a deeply divided country. White South Africans made up only about 20% of the population, but they held nearly all the political and economic power. And even among whites, there were divisions. The English-speaking elites descended from the British, and the Afrikaners descended from Dutch settlers. The Afrikaners had a long memory. They remembered losing the Anglo-Boer War at the hands of the British in 1902. They remembered the scorched earth policies and the concentration camps where thousands of Afrikaner women and children died. This pain, combined with a sense of cultural pride, fueled a new political movement, Afrikaner nationalism. One of the most influential groups in this movement was Broederbond, a secretive society of Afrikaner men. Founded in 1918, the Broederbond's mission was to unite Afrikaners, promote their language, and ensure Afrikaner dominance in South Africa. They infiltrated politics, education, the church, and even business. Their influence was immense. By the time World War II ended in 1945, Afrikaner nationalists felt sidelined by the British-descended elite who controlled mining and finance. The Afrikaners, many of them poor farmers, wanted to protect their identity, and they saw racial segregation as the way to do it. This ideology found its political voice in the National Party, led by Dr. Daniel Francois Malon. Malon promised to formalize and strengthen racial separation into a complete system. He called it apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness. The general election of May 26, 1948 would become one of the most pivotal moments in South African history. The ruling United Party, led by John Smuts, campaigned on moderate racial policies. Smuts had been a respected figure internationally, even working on the creation of the United Nations. But at home, many whites, especially Afrikaners, saw him as too liberal, too willing to allow limited rights for Black South Africans. The National Party, on the other hand, offered something different. Their manifesto promised stricter racial separation, better jobs for whites, and laws to prevent racial mixing. They used fear to rally their base, painting images of a swamped white minority if Black South Africans were given equal rights. To the shock of many, the National Party won. They didn't get the majority of votes. In fact, they secured only about 38% of the national votes. But due to the way parliamentary seats were distributed, they ended up with a majority in parliament. When D.F. Malone was sworn in as Prime Minister on June 4, 1948, apartheid was no longer just an idea, it was a government policy. Immediately after taking power, the National Party began passing laws that codified apartheid into the very fabric of society. The prohibition of mixed marriages, the Immorality Amendment Act, the Population Registration Act, the Groups Area Act, and the Pass Laws Act. These laws were just the beginning. Over the next decades, apartheid expanded into every corner of life: education, healthcare, public facilities, and even beaches. Of course, these measures did not go unchallenged. In 1912, decades later, African leaders had already formed the South African Native National Congress, later renamed the African National Congress, ANC. By the 1950s, the ANC began organizing protests, strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, encouraging Black South Africans to deliberately break apartheid laws by entering whites-only areas without passes. Tens of thousands participated, but the government's response was brutal. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo were arrested. Laws were tightened even further, and in 1953, the apartheid state introduced the Bantu Education Act, which deliberately gave black children an inferior education designed only to prepare them for low-paying jobs. By the mid-1950s, apartheid was no longer just a policy, it was a complete system, a machine of racial oppression designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. By the late 1950s, apartheid had already created a suffocating system of racial oppression. The pass laws were among the most hated of all apartheid policies. Black South Africans had to carry passbooks everywhere they went, and police regularly harassed and arrested those who failed to produce them. On March 21, 1960, in the township of Sharpeville near Johannesburg, thousands of protesters gathered outside the police station. The demonstration was organized by the Pan-Africanist Congress (PAC), a breakaway from the ANC, under the leadership of Robert Sobukwe. Their strategy was simple but powerful. People would present themselves at police stations without their passes, demanding arrest. The idea was to overwhelm the system, but the response was catastrophic. Police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. In a matter of minutes, 69 people lay dead and over 180 were wounded. Most were shot in the back as they tried to flee. The massacre shocked the world. The government declared a state of emergency, banned the ANC and PAC, and arrested thousands of activists. Peaceful protests now seemed impossible. Among the deeply affected by Sharpeville was Nelson Mandela, a young lawyer and activist with the ANC. Until then, Mandela and the ANC had championed non-violent resistance. But after Sharpeville, many leaders felt they had no choice but to fight fire with fire. In 1961, Mandela and others founded Umkhonto weZizwe, Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. Their mission was to sabotage, targeting government buildings, power stations, and infrastructure without killing civilians. Mandela traveled across Africa to seek support and military training. But by 1962, he was arrested and sentenced to 5 years for incitement and leaving the country illegally. 2 years later, in 1964, he and other ANC leaders were put on trial in what would become known as the Rivonia trial. Facing the death penalty, Mandela delivered his now famous speech, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Instead of execution, Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend the next 27 years behind bars, mostly on Robben Island, becoming the face of resistance. By the 1960s, apartheid was no longer just a South African issue, it was a global scandal. The United Nations condemned apartheid, calling it a crime against humanity. African nations newly independent from colonial rule pushed for international sanctions. In 1962, the UN passed a resolution calling on the countries to cut off trade and arms sales to South Africa. However, many Western powers, including the United States and Britain, were reluctant. The Cold War loomed large, and South Africa was seen as a key ally against communism. Still, international opposition grew. By the late 1960s, artists, students, and activists around the world launched boycotts, refusing to play in South Africa, refusing to buy South African goods and demanding corporations divest. One of the most symbolic protests was in the world of sports. In 1964, South Africa was banned from the Olympic Games. By the 1970s, international cricket and rugby teams refused to play them. Sports, once a source of pride for the apartheid state, became a global embarrassment. Despite the international pressure, apartheid only grew harsher inside South Africa. In 1976, the government introduced a new law requiring that schools for Black South Africans teach certain subjects in Afrikaans rather than English. For many students, Afrikaans was seen as the language of oppression, the tongue of the apartheid state. On June 16, 1976, thousands of students in Soweto, a township outside Johannesburg, marched in protest. They carried placards reading, "Down with Africans" and "We want equal education." What began as a peaceful demonstration turned into a massacre. Police fired live ammunition into the crowds. By the end of that day, at least 176 students were killed. Some estimates put the number much higher. One photograph in particular shocked the world. A dying 13-year-old boy named Hector Peterson being carried by another student and his sister running beside them in tears. This image became an icon of apartheid's cruelty. The Soweto uprising sparked months of nationwide unrest. Hundreds more were killed in clashes, but it also reignited the struggle, inspiring a new generation of young activists to join the fight. Amid the waves of resistance rose a powerful new voice, Steve Biko. In the early 1970s, Biko founded the Black Consciousness Movement, which encouraged Black South Africans to embrace their identity, reject feelings of inferiority, and fight psychological oppression. He believed true liberation required not just political freedom, but also mental emancipation. Biko's words inspired thousands of students and activists, but the government saw him as a threat. In 1977, he was arrested, brutally beaten in police custody, and died at the age of 30. His death, like Xenophobia and Soweto, became another rallying cry for resistance. International outreach grew louder, and the world could no longer look away. By the late 1970s, apartheid was still in full force, but the cracks were beginning to show. Resistance inside South Africa was stronger than ever. Outside, international condemnation and sanctions continued to mount. Yet, the apartheid state dug in its heels, determined to preserve white minority rule at any cost. The next decade, the 1980s, would bring even more unrest, brutal repression, and finally, the beginning of apartheid's collapse. By the 1980s, apartheid had been in a place for more than 3 decades. Entire generations of Black South Africans had grown up under racial segregation, forced removals, and systematic humiliation. But resistance was stronger than ever, and the apartheid regime was beginning to lose control. Inside the country, uprisings and strikes spread like wildfire. The Soweto protests of 1976 had ignited a new spirit of defiance. By the early 1980s, trade unions and student organizations were at the forefront of the struggle. In 1983, a broad coalition known as the United Democratic Front (UDF) was formed, uniting over 400 groups against apartheid. The government responded with brutal force. In 1985, President P.W. Botha declared a state of emergency, granting the police and military sweeping powers. Thousands were detained without trial. Torture disappearances became commonplace, but instead of crushing resistance, this only fueled anger. Outside South Africa, the world's patience had run out. Throughout the 1980s, international sanctions tightened. Western companies pulled out of South Africa and many nations banned trade, oil exports, and financial investments. The global Free Mandela campaign spread across campuses and cities, turning Nelson Mandela, still imprisoned on Robben Island, into a symbol of the global fight for justice. In 1986, the United States passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, overriding a veto by President Ronald Reagan. Britain under Margaret Thatcher resisted sweeping sanctions, but even she faced immense pressure from activists and the Commonwealth. By the late 1980s, South Africa was in crisis. The economy was collapsing under sanctions. Townships were erupting in rebellion. The military was overstretched, fighting not only protesters at home, but also wars in neighboring Angola and Namibia. In 1989, Botha suffered a stroke and was forced to resign. His successor, F.W. de Klerk, recognized what Botha could not. Apartheid was unsustainable. On February 2, 1990, de Klerk made a historic announcement before the parliament. The ANC and the other banned political groups would be legalized. Political prisoners would be released, and South Africa would begin negotiations for a new political order. 9 days later, on February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. The world watched in awe as the tall, grey-haired figure raised his fist in triumph, walking hand in hand with his wife, Winnie Mandela. It was a moment that symbolized hope after decades of darkness. Mandela's release did not mean the struggle was over. The early 1990s were some of the most violent years in South Africa's history. As negotiations for a democratic South Africa began, violence erupted between rival groups. The apartheid government secretly armed factions to create instability, hoping to weaken the ANC. Townships burned and thousands were killed in political clashes, but Mandela remained steady alongside de Klerk. He worked to steer the country towards democracy. In 1993, both men were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. Finally, in April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. For the first time, Black South Africans could vote. Long lines stretched outside polling stations as millions cast ballots. When the results came in, the ANC had won by a landslide. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was sworn in as South Africa's first black president. His inauguration at the Union Buildings in Pretoria was attended by leaders from around the world. The nightmare of apartheid had ended. The story of how apartheid began and how it ended is a reminder of both the darkness of human prejudice and the resilience of those who resist it. From the first settlers in 1652 to the election of 1948 to Mandela's release in 1990, this history reveals how laws can divide people, but also how people can rise to break them. If you stayed with me through this journey, you now know the roots of apartheid, how it became law, and how it finally fell. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to explore more hidden truths of African history, culture, and people. Until next time, remember, history isn't just the past, it's the foundation of the present.
We all ran amok in confusion, running for cover. I didn't even think of my brother would be in that, because we were told that only secondary and high schools were to take part. Then I spotted my younger brother on the opposite side of the pavement. He was too young to understand what was really going on. I just said to him, "No, you must just stay here next to me. I'll make sure I find a way back home." While I was talking to him, there was another shot, and we went two separate ways.
I was very close from where the police were shooting, and I saw a person fell down, but I did not expect to see a 13-year-old boy being shot by the police.
As I sneaked back to the pavement, he was nowhere to be seen.
When I took that picture, Boiso Makuba picked him up to get Hector Peters into the clinic.
So I quickly ran to the scene. I was trying to explain myself. "This is my younger brother. Where are you taking him?" The man never said anything, and I looked at my brother. I saw blood coming from the side of the mouth. As he was about to put my brother in the car, he said, "He's dead."
The year is 1976. A young boy named Hector Peterson lies lifeless in the streets of Soweto. His sister runs beside him, her face frozen in shock as a stranger carries his small body. Around them, smoke rises, gunshots echo, children scatter. The apartheid police had opened fire on unarmed students protesting the language of their education. This is just one day in a system that lasted nearly 50 years, a system that turned neighbors into enemies, families into outcasts, and entire cities into prisons for Black South Africans. But what did it actually mean to live under apartheid? In this video, we are going deep into what everyday life was like, from segregated branches and forced removals to the quiet moments of resistance that helped bring it all crashing down. By the end, you'll see not just the pain and oppression, but the strength and humanity of those who endured it. It is June 1948. The National Party, led by Daniel Francois Malone, had just won the general election. For many white South Africans, especially Afrikaners, this is a victory. For them, this election promises to protect their way of life, their farms, their jobs, and their families from what they now see as a growing threat. But for Black South Africans, this victory feels like a death sentence. They already lived under racism. They already faced land disposition under earlier laws like the 1930 Natives Land Act, which confined them to just 7% of the country's land. But apartheid was different. It wasn't just racism. It was a system carefully written, debated, passed through parliament, and signed into law, designed to strip away every last freedom and control every aspect of Black life in South Africa. The most hated of these laws were the pass laws. Imagine this. You're a grown man and you cannot walk freely in your city unless you carry a little book called a passbook at all times. This book contains your photo, your personal information, where you work, and where you are allowed to be. If a policeman stops you, and they often did, and you don't have this book on you, you are arrested, not warned, not fined, but arrested. You are thrown into a police van and taken away, sometimes for months, to perform hard labor. In the 1950s, the number of black South Africans arrested under the past laws reached hundreds of thousands every year. It was not just humiliating, it was a constant reminder that you were considered a visitor in your own country. Under apartheid, families were uprooted from areas considered white and dumped in segregated townships. Places like Soweto, near Johannesburg, and Langa, near Cape Town, grew rapidly as the government forcibly removed entire communities under the Group Area Act of 1950. Houses were tiny, often just 2 rooms for a family of 6 or 7. Streets were dusty, water was scarce, electricity became a luxury. But worse than the poverty was the psychological violence. You were not allowed to live near your work. You had to commute often for hours from these townships into white cities only to return before curfew. And you could not fight back, because if you protested, you risked losing your job or worse, your freedom. Apartheid showed itself in big laws, but also in the smallest, most humiliating ways. You could not sit on the same benches as whites. You could not swim in the same beaches. You could not marry someone who was white. You could not vote. Signs went up everywhere, Europeans only. Imagine walking past a park and seeing a sign telling you that you are not human enough to sit on its grass. Imagine being thirsty and realizing the water fountain in front of you is off limits because of the color of your skin. For children growing up in the 1950s, this was normal. They didn't know anything else. They played in dusty streets. They saw their parents bow their heads when speaking to white policemen. But not everyone bowed their head. This was the time when movements like ANC, the African National Congress, began to organize in new ways. Young leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu were becoming more radical. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, a massive non-violent protest where thousands of people deliberately broke apartheid laws, refusing to carry their passbooks, entering white-only zones, and getting arrested in large numbers. The idea was simple: overwhelm the system, make it impossible for the government to jail everyone. The government responded harshly. Police used batons, dogs, and guns to disperse crowds. New laws were passed to silence dissent, including the Suppression of Communism Act, which allowed the government to ban activists, confining them to certain areas and preventing them from meeting in groups. Still, the resistance grew. In 1955, a historic gathering of anti-apartheid groups met at Cape Town and adopted the Freedom Charter, a document that declared, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white." For the government, this was revolutionary, even dangerous. For ordinary black South Africans, it was a sign of hope. But by the late 1950s, frustrations was boiling over. The ANC's calls for peaceful protests were not enough for everyone. A breakaway group, the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, led by Robert Sobukwe, argued for a more African-centered struggle. On March 21, 1960, the PAC organized a nationwide protest against the past laws. In a small township called Sharpeville, near Johannesburg, thousands of men, women, and children gathered outside the police station. They carried no weapons. Many left their passbooks at home on purpose, daring the police to arrest them. And the police panicked. What happened next would change the world's view of apartheid forever. The crowd swelled to about 5,000 people. Police brought in armored cars and set up a line of armed officers. Then, no one knows who gave the order, but the police opened fire. In less than 2 minutes, 69 people were dead, 180 more were wounded. News of the massacre spread quickly, not just across South Africa, but across the world. For the first time, apartheid's cruelty was on full display for the international community. In the days after Sharpeville, protests erupted across the country. The government declared a state of emergency and arrested more than 18,000 people. The ANC and the PAC were banned. For Nelson Mandela and his comrades, Sharpeville was a turning point. They realized that peaceful protests alone would not end apartheid. A new, more militant phase of the struggle was about to begin. But that is the story of the next part, where we'll look at the Soweto uprising, international pressure, and the eventual fall of apartheid decades later.
The Africans want the franchise on the basis of one man, one vote. They want political independence.
Do you see Africans being able to develop in this country without the European being pushed out?
We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country.
Are there many educated Africans in South Africa?
Yes. We have a large number of Africans who are educated and who are taking part in the political struggles of the African people. The question of education has nothing to do with the question of the vote. On numerous occasions, it has been proved in history that people can enjoy the vote even if they have no education. Of course, we desire education, and we think it's a good thing. But you don't have to have education in order to know that you want certain fundamental rights, you have got aspirations, you have got claims. It has nothing to do with education whatsoever.
Are you planning any more campaigns of non-cooperation?
Yes. The Pietermaritzburg resolution makes provision for a campaign of non-cooperation with the government, and we are presently studying plans to implement this aspect of the resolution.
If Dr. Verwoerd's government doesn't give you the kind of concessions that you want sometime soon, is there any likelihood of violence?
There are many people who feel that the reaction of the government to our stay at home, ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arresting 10,000s of Africans, the show of force throughout the country, notwithstanding our clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines, close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
The year is 1976. Imagine you, a black teenager in Soweto. You wake up before sunrise, put on your school uniform, and walk to school with your friends. But when you arrive, you are told that starting today, you will be taught half your subjects in Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, the language of the police who harass your father, and the government that controls your life. You are angry. Everyone is angry. But no one knows that in just a few hours, the anger of school children will shake the foundations of apartheid and send shockwaves around the world. On the morning of June 16, 1976, more than 10,000 students marched peacefully through the streets of Soweto, holding placards that read, "Down with Africans" and singing freedom songs. They were unarmed, they were just children, but the police confronted them with tear gas and live ammunition. The first shot killed Hector Peterson, a 13-year-old boy. A photograph of his limp body being carried by another student with his sister running alongside screaming became one of the most iconic images of the struggle.
On the 16th of June in 1976, we were so excited. It was like we were going on a school trip.
To them, it was just a joyful march.
The singing, the chanting, we felt free.
Surprisingly, the whole of Soweto came together to march. About 10,000 students. As I was marching with the students, I drifted away from them because I didn't know how it was going to happen. But I knew they would be arrested or even shot by the police.
Police barricaded some of the street, so our leaders told us that other schools are on the way.
The student leader climbed on top of the tree, telling them that this is a peaceful march. I was between the police and the students. I put my armband, which has got written press here, so that the police must identify me as a journalist, not a student.
While waiting for these other students, all of a sudden, there was a shot.
All the police were just shooting at random. So the students scattered. I think what provoked the police is that they sang the song which was banned in South Africa, Kosisigelela, which today is a national anthem.
We all ran amok in confusion, running for cover. I didn't even think of my brother would be in that because we were told that only secondary and high schools were to take part. Then I spotted my younger brother on the opposite side of the pavement. He was too young to understand what was really going on. I just said to him, "No, you must just stay here next to me. I'll make sure I find a way back home." While I was talking to him, there was another shot, and we went two separate ways.
I was very close from where the police were shooting. And I saw a person fell down, but I did not expect to see a 13-year-old boy being shot by the police.
As I sneaked back to the pavement, he was nowhere to be seen.
When I took that picture, Buiso Makuba picked him up to get Hector Peterson into the clinic.
So I quickly ran to the scene. I was trying to explain myself. "This is my younger brother. Where are you taking him?" The man never said anything. And I looked at my brother. I saw blood coming from the side of the mouth. As he was about to put my brother in the car, he said, "He's dead."
The Soweto uprising marked a new phase of resistance. Before 1976, much of the anti-apartheid struggle had been led by adults, the ANC, PAC, and trade unions. But now, the youths were rising. Students boycotted schools, workers went on strike, the country became ungovernable. The government responded with even more violence, arresting thousands, torturing activists, and killing some in detention, including Steve Biko in 1977, the charismatic leader of the Black Consciousness movement. Biko's death became another rallying cry, and his face, calm, defiant, was seen on posters around the world. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the world could no longer ignore what was happening. Countries began imposing economic sanctions. Global campaigns called for boycott of South African goods, sports teams, and cultural exchanges. In 1983, the United Democratic Front, UDF, was formed, an umbrella movement that brought together churches, unions, students, and civic organizations. It was essentially a new internal ANC. The township erupted in protests almost daily. Streets were barricaded with burning tires. Police used armored vehicles called car spares to control neighborhoods. The smell of tear gas became a normal part of life. Meanwhile, Nelson Mandela had been in prison since 1964, locked away on Robben Island for 18 of those years, then moved to Portsmouth Prison in Cape Town. The government hoped the world would forget him. Instead, his name became a global symbol of freedom. Graffiti across cities worldwide read, "Free Nelson Mandela." And inside prison, Mandela never gave up. He learned Afrikaans so he could speak directly to the guards. He kept himself disciplined, exercised daily, and secretly communicated with ANC leaders on the outside through coded letters. By the late 1980s, the South African government was crumbling under pressure. The economy was in trouble, protests were unending, and even some white South Africans were calling for change. In 1989, President Botha suffered a stroke and was replaced by F.W. de Klerk, a man who understood that apartheid could not survive much longer. In February 1990, de Klerk shocked the world. He announced the unbanning of the ANC, PAC, and other anti-apartheid groups, and then, on February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, holding Winnie Mandela's hand, smiling and raising his fists. It had been 27 years since he last tasted freedom.
In pursuance of my opening address to Parliament, I am now in a position to announce that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released at the Victor Verster prison on Sunday, the 11th of February, at about 3 p.m. Yesterday evening, I met with Mr. Mandela in Cape Town, together with Ministers Viljoen and Coetzee. During the meeting, Mr. Mandela was informed of the government's decision regarding his release. We would all like Mr. Mandela's release to take place in a dignified and orderly manner. To attain this, government officials are at the moment involved in discussions with parties concerned in order to afford them the opportunity to make suitable arrangements. Two issues were also raised during the discussions between me and Mr. Mandela, namely the state of emergency and the position of persons serving sentences for politically motivated crimes, as well as those who have committed such crimes and who are now outside the country. I stressed the importance of creating conditions which would enable me to lift the state of emergency without jeopardizing the maintenance of law and order. Regarding the position of persons involved in politically motivated crimes, I indicated that while this is a matter that should be dealt with in negotiations, exploratory discussions could take place in the meantime. I want to emphasize that there can no longer be any doubt about the government's sincerity to create a just dispensation based on negotiations. I call upon Mr. Mandela and all other interested parties to make their contribution towards a positive climate for negotiations. The eyes of the world are presently focused on all South Africans. All of us now have an opportunity and the responsibility to prove that we are capable of a peaceful process in creating a new South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, this announcement and tomorrow will bring us to the end of a long chapter. What I have announced today was started by my predecessor a number of years ago. Since the moment that Mr. Mandela met him at Tuinhuis, and since the moment that in that discussion Mr. Mandela clearly stated his commitment also to peaceful solutions, it has become a certainty that he would be released. Also, in my 2 discussions with him, late last year and last evening, I came to the conclusion that he is committed to a peaceful solution and a peaceful process. The government is committed to negotiation. The government is committed to bring about, through negotiation, a new constitution which is fair and just to all the people of South Africa. I hope that now that this chapter has ended, that the world, and more especially all the people of South Africa, will grasp the opportunity and play whatever supportive role can be played towards a peaceful conclusion to the process which has started.
But the struggle was not over. The early 1990s were filled with negotiations, but also with bloodshed. Violence erupted between ANC supporters and the Inkatha Freedom Party. Yet, Mandela and de Klerk passed on, determined to create a new South Africa. Finally, in April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. For the first time, Black South Africans stood in long lines to cast their votes. Some waited for hours, some cried as they held the ballot paper. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first Black president. The world watched as he stood on the steps of the Union Building in Pretoria and declared, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." For many South Africans, the day Mandela became president felt like waking from a nightmare. Apartheid had ended, at least legally, but the scars remained. Townships were still poor, inequality was still massive, and many victims of apartheid were left without justice. Yet, there was also hope. For the first time, children could go to school without fear of being taught in Afrikaans. Families could live where they wanted. People could dream of a future where skin color no longer determined destiny. Apartheid is not ancient history. Many of the people who lived through it are still alive today, still telling their stories. And understanding their pain helps us see why racism, inequality, and xenophobia still hurt South Africa today. But the truth is, apartheid did not just separate people by race, it tried to crush their spirit. And the fact that they resisted, that they kept fighting, kept singing, and kept hoping, is one of the greatest human stories of the 20th century.
Nigeria is to repatriate hundreds of its citizens living in
South
South
Africa entrant Chidima Adesina has withdrawn from the competition.
It was September 2019, Johannesburg. The streets were tense, restless, filled with smoke from burning shops and the distant sound of sirens that had become far too familiar. In the middle of this chaos lay Emmanuel Chukwuemeka, a young Nigerian man, beaten and left lifeless during one of the most violent waves of xenophobic attacks in South Africa. To the authorities, he was just another victim, but to his family in Nigeria, Emmanuel's death tore through their world like a hurricane. He had left home searching for opportunity, the kind that South Africa, Africa's most industrialized nation, promised. Instead, he found hatred, suspicion, and violence. His story wasn't isolated, it was part of a troubling pattern. In 2019 alone, more than a dozen Nigerians lost their lives in South Africa under similar circumstances. Each death sparked outrage in Lagos, Abuja, and beyond. Twitter hashtags called for boycott of South African businesses in Nigeria. Angry protesters stormed the outlets of MTN and ShopRite. Politicians gave fiery speeches about retaliation. But beneath all this noise was a deeper, more unsettling question. How did it come to this?
Nigeria is to repatriate hundreds of its citizens living in South Africa after a recent spate of xenophobic attacks, mainly against African foreigners.
Victor Issa only has a couple hours left to spend with his girlfriend in South Africa. It's been a year since he arrived here with big plans for the future, but then he was confronted with an outbreak of violence against foreigners.
My plan initial state when I was coming to this country is to make a better living because I'm a mechanic by profession. I fix cars, but my past experience here in this country has never impressed me to stay back. So, and my place where I've got this thing that it's better you come back home alive than for you to die in that man's country. So it's better for me to go. Yeah, because the kind of people here are not the kind of people I need to be with. They don't care about your security, they don't care how you feel. They do things as if they are stupid.
Nigeria and South Africa weren't always enemies. In fact, there was a time when their relationship was built on solidarity, sacrifice, and shared struggle. Yet, decades later, these two nations, Africa's giants, had become symbols of mistrust, resentment, and violence. The death of Emmanuel wasn't just about xenophobia. It was about history, about promises betrayed, about wounds that never healed. To understand why South Africans and Nigerians have found themselves on opposite sides of rage, we need to rewind back to the years when the bond was brotherly, when Nigeria carried South Africa's struggles on its shoulders. Because only then, through that journey, can we understand how a young man's life was cut short in Johannesburg, and why the dream of African unity keeps slipping further away. To understand today's hostility, we must remember a time when South Africans and Nigerians stood together, a time when the word brotherhood wasn't just a political slogan, it was lived, it was real. Let's go back to the 1960s and 70s. South Africa was still locked in the brutal chains of apartheid, a system that stripped black South Africans of their dignity, land, and freedom. Nelson Mandela was behind bars on Robben Island. Countless activists were hunted, silenced, or killed. The apartheid regime was powerful, backed by wealth and weapons, but it had one major enemy outside its borders: Nigeria. Nigeria had just gained independence in 1960, and within its newfound freedom came an overwhelming sense of duty. The Nigerian government declared apartheid an offense against humanity. Schools, markets, and even ordinary families rallied behind this cause. University students organized protests in Lagos and Ibadan, chanting for South Africa's liberation. Nigerian workers agreed to deductions from their salaries, real money taken from their pockets to fund the anti-apartheid struggle. And it wasn't only symbolic. Nigeria put its money where its mouth was. In 1976, it set up the Southern Africa Relief Fund, SARF, which raised millions of dollars for the African National Congress and for black South African students forced to flee apartheid. Nigerian passports were given to South African exiles, allowing them to travel across the world, lobby for support, and find safety. Mandela himself would later acknowledge these debts. On his first visit to Nigeria in 1990, after his release, he told crowds in Lagos, "Nigeria gave us the resources. Nigeria gave us the voice. Nigeria gave us hope." And ordinary Nigerians were proud of this role. In those days, helping South Africa was seen as helping Africa. If one country was oppressed, all were oppressed. If one nation was silent, the others had a duty to shout. But here is where the irony begins. Because when apartheid finally crumbled in 1994 and South Africa emerged into democracy, many Nigerians expected a bond sealed forever, one of eternal gratitude, respect, and partnership. Instead, what followed would shock them. The year was 1994. Apartheid was gone. Nelson Mandela was president, and South Africa was reborn as the Rainbow Nation. Across Africa, there was joy. Nigeria especially celebrated, proud that its years of sacrifice had finally paid off. But beneath the surface of celebration, seeds of tensions were already being planted. South Africa, with its rich minerals, strong economy, and newly opened markets, quickly became a magnet for opportunity. At the same time, Nigeria in the 1990s was sinking deeper into economic decline, political instability, and military dictatorship. Jobs were scarce, corruption rampant, and the dream of a better life felt distant. So naturally, many Nigerians looked south. They traveled to Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Cape Town, searching for work, education, and survival. Traders set up shops, students filled universities, and workers found places in construction, hospitality, and transport. For Nigerians, South Africa looked like a land of promise, the same way Europe or America did. But to South Africans, just emerging from decades of apartheid, the arrival of thousands of Nigerians was not always seen as brotherhood. Instead, resentment began to grow. Here is why. South Africa's own economy, though stronger than most of the continent, still carried deep scars of apartheid. Black South Africans, after generations of oppression, were still struggling to find housing, land, and jobs. Inequality was everywhere, so when migrants, Nigerians included, were seen opening shops or working in positions that some locals wanted, frustrations quickly turned to anger. And then came the stereotypes. Nigerians were portrayed in South African media as drug dealers, scammers, and criminals, a dangerous and unfair caricature that erased the millions of who were honest workers, students, and professionals. Politicians, looking for easy targets, fueled this perception by blaming foreigners for unemployment and crime. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, resentment was solidifying into something darker. The brotherhood of the 70s had faded into suspicion. Nigerians, once hailed as liberators, were now accused of taking too much. One striking example came in 2001, when then-President Thabo Mbeki's government began openly debating stricter immigration laws, with Nigerians singled out in public discourse as part of a problem. The same Nigerians whose parents had contributed to the ANC's struggles now found themselves unwelcome in the Rainbow Nation. And in Nigeria, many could not believe what they were seeing. They had given money, resources, and moral support to South Africa for decades. But now, their children were being targeted, accused, and sometimes violently attacked. This was the beginning of the rift, a slow but steady unraveling of what once looked like an unshakable bond.
On behalf of our people and government, I humbly convey to our people, our foreign guests, all Africa, and the peoples of the world, our apology that we allowed criminals in our midst to inflict terrible pain and damage to many in our society. We will do everything possible and necessary to ensure that we have no need in future to proffer this humble apology, which is inspired by genuine remorse.
But for some at the ceremony, Mbeki's apology was too little, too late.
It has taken him too long to react. He had some other business to attend to other than issues. These were pressing issues. People were dying, and he never said anything.
I think it was a waste of time. Yeah. We are forgiven him, it's fine. But we wouldn't forget. And also apology. He is right. The president is very right to have apology, to give a sense of apology to us. But at the end of the day, our situation will remain same.
By the mid-2000s, the frustration that had been building for years finally exploded. In 2008, South Africa experienced its first wave of large-scale xenophobic violence. It started in the township of Alexandra, Johannesburg, when mobs of South Africans attacked foreign-owned shops, burned homes, and beat people in the streets. The violence spread quickly to other parts of the country, leaving at least 62 people dead, many of them Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, Somalis, and Nigerians. Thousands more were displaced, forced to flee, with only the clothes on their backs. For Nigerians, the attacks confirmed their worst fears. They had gone from being hailed as liberators to being hunted like outsiders. The images were shocking. Men chased with machetes, women hiding in churches, children crying in the arms of strangers. The term xenophobia became forever linked to South Africa in the Nigerian imagination. But this was only the beginning. The years that followed brought more violence. 2015, another wave erupted. In Durban, mobs looted shops owned by Nigerians and other Africans. A viral photo of a man being set on fire in broad daylight shocked the world. South African leaders at the time condemned the violence, but some of their words also fueled resentment. King Goodwill Zwelithini, a traditional leader of the Zulu nation, was accused of sparking tensions when he said foreigners should pack their bags and go. Then came 2017 and 2018. Smaller outbreaks continued. Nigerians attacked, their businesses destroyed, and in 2019, it reached another boiling point. It was in this year that Emmanuel Chukwuemeka, a young Nigerian, lost his life in Johannesburg. He was one of many Nigerians caught in the wave of anti-immigrant violence that rocked the city. His death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a wider storm. Nigerians were dragged from their homes, shops were looted, and at least a dozen people were killed. This time, the reaction from Nigeria was fierce. Hashtags like "Say No to Xenophobia" and "Nigerians in South Africa" trended worldwide. Nigerian celebrities called for a boycott of South African businesses like MTN, ShopRite, and DSTV.
Protesters raided the offices of South African communications giant MTN and its affiliate ShopRite, halting operations.
It's like 4 days I've not been in their office before, but presently as I'm speaking with you people, my stock is going down.
This is not the first time xenophobic attacks on Nigerian nationals in South Africa have triggered reprisals. Similar reprisals happened after attacks in South Africa killed 62 people in 2008 and 7 more in 2015. Nigerian protesters accused the South African government of not addressing the issue.
Why can't South Africans leave Nigerians in their country to go about their businesses? We have made Nigeria comfortable for them. We're not disturbing them. We're not burning down their houses or businesses.
The relationship between these two countries, once bonded by sacrifice, had now sunk into open hostility. For South Africans, the justification was often framed around unemployment, crime, and survival. For Nigerians, the attacks were seen as betrayal, a stab in the back from a nation they had helped free. By the 2020s, xenophobic attacks had become almost expected, recurring in waves. And while government officials from both countries have held countless meetings, signed agreements, and promised change, the truth remains bitter. On the streets, the hatred between some South Africans and Nigerians is still alive. The violence wasn't just about jobs or crimes anymore. It had grown into something deeper, a wound of mistrust, stereotypes, and unresolved history. The fallout of the xenophobic violence between South Africans and Nigerians has been both immediate and long-lasting, affecting politics, business, culture, and even the way ordinary citizens view each other. After every outbreak of violence, relationship between the two governments plunged into crisis. In 2019, following the killing of Emmanuel Chukwuemeka and others, Nigeria's government recalled its ambassador to South Africa. Nigerian airlines like Air Peace offered free evacuation flights for stranded citizens. It was a rare moment where thousands lined up to leave, not for opportunity, but for survival. South African officials, on their part, issued apologies and called for calm, but Nigerians often felt those apologies were empty, given how frequently the violence recurred. At one point, Nigeria temporarily shut down the operations of some South African companies, citing security and regulatory reasons, though many saw it as retaliation. The story of Nigeria and South Africa is a tragic contradiction. Two nations that once stood shoulder to shoulder against apartheid are now locked in circles of mistrust and violence. The death of Emmanuel Chukwuemeka in 2019 is just one of many reminders that xenophobia kills not only individuals, but the very dream of African solidarity. Yet, there is also hope. If the same energy that fueled the liberation movement, the same passion that built global music cultures, and the same spirit of resilience in both peoples can be channeled towards unity, then perhaps Nigeria and South Africa can turn a page. Because in truth, these two countries are too big, too powerful, and too culturally influential to remain enemies. Their destiny and Africa's is tied together. Whether they choose to build bridges or burn them will shape the continent's future.